We, of course, gathered at a highly significant time at the beginning of the Copenhagen conference. And what I would like to do is talk a little bit about that, but also about what follows and the actions that I think we're going to need to take in order to protect the environment going forward, by reference to my own brief, which is on the DEFRA side, which of course does not include climate change mitigation, though I will speak to that as well. And I'd like to start off just by talking about the Conservative Party's green agenda, and to say one thing very clearly, which is that to those who suggest that the attachment which the Conservative Party has to these issues has been set out very clearly by David Cameron, who actually took the lead in raising the profile of some of these issues in the UK, including the climate change issue from the point of view of the response of political parties, and of course we took the lead in arguing for binding targets in relation to the Climate Change Act. This is not any kind of transient attachment to these issues. In my view, the idea of living sustainably and of intergenerational responsibility, that is, holding what we have in trust for successive generations, is actually an integral part of Conservative philosophy, which you can trace back to Burke and beyond. And indeed, there have been many examples of progressive environmental legislation throughout the centuries, which have been led by Conservative governments. Margaret Thatcher herself did, of course, take a lead in relation to air quality issues in the 1980s, and was no stranger to science. And I believe that, therefore, it's important to understand that the blue-green agenda is written deep into the modern Conservative Party's DNA, and it is here to stay. If there is anything that we have learned, it seems to me, over the last few years, in the last 2 years particularly, it is that whether you are an individual or a business or a government, you cannot, at the end of the day, live beyond your means. This government has learned the hard way that you cannot live beyond your economic means. That is a lesson, of course, which no business needs to be taught. Every businessman understands that. But just as you cannot live beyond your economic means, so it seems to me that you cannot live beyond your environmental means. And the principle of sustainability, of driving sustainable patterns of behaviour, both in government and in civil society, should, I think, be fundamental to the way that a future government operates. Not any kind of accessory, not an afterthought, but fundamental to the way that we do business. And it seems to me that the challenge now is to rebuild growth on a sustainable footing. That means not just economically sustainable and avoiding the kinds of wrong policy decision making that we have seen, but also environmentally sustainable. And government has a huge role in that, as being a very big and indeed growing part of the economy. So let's go back to Copenhagen, which you can see, the importance of which one can see through that same prism of the importance of sustainability and intergenerational responsibility, of securing agreement that will ensure our environmental security in future. And I don't think we can restate too often the importance of that agreement, the importance of taking action, and of that agreement being binding and effective. But what then follows is equally important, which is translating that agreement and binding targets, which we hope will be written into law as they are in our own country, into action. And that leaves the question then of what is the government's role in translating that agreement into action, and what is the role of business and individuals and of society. And it's very important, it seems to me, that we have the right focus in that respect. Of course, government has a really important role, both in securing this agreement in the first place, in setting the right framework in taking the right decisions itself. So, for instance, over whether there should be a third runway at Heathrow. It seems to me that government must lead by example in deploying, for instance, its own spending power in relation to procurement. Food procurement is a very good example, one that I've spoken a little bit about. The government spends £2 billion a year on buying food itself. That's government with a small g, that's the public sector as a whole. If there were effective sustainable procurement requirements, which there aren't at the moment, that would make an enormous difference to the way in which food was purchased in this country and to local producers, and that same principle can be applied across the government's agenda. So government clearly has a very important leadership role and a role in setting the right framework, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But here's my central point. What is absolutely key, it seems to me, in future, is that we unlock the behavioural change that is going to be needed on the part of businesses, communities, and individuals, and translate what at the moment looks like an agreement or potential agreement between politicians into potential courses of action that are realistic and meaningful in people's lives, in the lives of individuals, and are realistic and deliverable in relation to what businesses want to do. And that is why I think it is so wrong, as some have sought to do, to suggest that what follows an agreement like this is all about government or all about big government, all about top-down direction. Quite apart from the fact that I think that runs the real danger of putting people off the agenda of living within our environmental means, of driving people away from making the changes that they need to make. And you can see, for instance, in some of the nascent campaigns in relation to telling people that they shouldn't eat meat, for instance, the dangers of an approach which is overly hair-shirt or unrealistic, or which actually conceals another agenda, but which has leapt onto the back of the climate change argument, in taking people in the wrong direction. People are suspicious of government, they're suspicious of politicians, they're wary of taxes being levied in the guise of green taxation, but actually is an excuse simply to tax them more. And I think that if we want an effective plan to translate the requirements which we're about to bind ourselves into in relation to reducing carbon and to decarbonise the economy effectively, it has to be constructed on the back of getting incentives right and making markets work correctly. And that is why we have been focusing so strongly, as you will have no doubt seen in recent weeks, on a set of policy announcements that underline the importance of those incentives, and indeed of enabling the changes of behaviour that we need to make. So, for instance, in relation to recycling, where Britain has still, I'm afraid, a poor record in comparison to our peer group countries, how are we going to drive up rates of recycling? Not, it seems to me, through a series of penalties, bin taxes, or a bullying approach which runs the risk of putting people off, but actually through an approach which incentivises people to do the right thing. And so we're interested in and excited by schemes like Recycle Bank, being pioneered by Windsor and Maidenhead Council, but already operating highly successfully in the United States, which actually gives people a financial reward for recycling and has seen rapidly escalating recycling rates accordingly. So, for instance, in relation to renewable energy generation, with schemes that can excite local public opposition, no, we don't believe that the right approach is either to grandstand and beat up local councils and demand and penalise them for taking the wrong decisions, because we believe in local decision making. The right approach, it seems to me, is to incentivise local communities to the greatest extent that we can, to take decisions which actually are in their interests and reward them accordingly. And so, for instance, we've talked about the kinds of fiscal incentives we could take in relation to business rates and sharing the benefits of cheaper electricity, which we could offer to communities through an extension of things like wind and energy from waste, so that we're taking an approach which doesn't bully communities into taking action. If we start down that line, I believe we actually won't achieve the results that we want to, but actually encourages communities to come with us. And another, I think, very powerful example of getting an incentive right in a very important area is in relation to energy emissions from homes. We know the single biggest source of emissions at the moment where action needs to be taken. We've framed a Green Deal which will actually capture the future savings that people will make from taking energy efficient measures and effectively captures those savings and gives those to people up front so that they can make personal investment in the energy efficiency measures in their own homes. And in doing so, they can not only have the money that will enable them to make the changes, but also will themselves save money on their bills in the future. So in all of these examples, we have incentives aligned and moving people in the right direction. But none of that is to deny the role of government. And the Green Deal is a very good example of that, because here's an example of a policy which actually relies on the government being in a position to capture those savings, to offer the money up front, to organise the scheme that will then encourage people to make the changes in behaviour. It's innovative in the way that I hope you will see much more of in a future putative Conservative government. Innovative because it captures future savings, it doesn't rely on increases in public spending where we know that public money is not available. It relies on individual application. It doesn't cajole. It is, in its own way, a mini market scheme, but it's one where government is playing a very important enabling role. In that sense, it seems to me to be a very good example of the kind of direction that we want to go into. And another example of the kind of government action we do need to take would be in relation to, for instance, ensuring that there are feed-in tariffs to incentivise that investment in renewable power. There are other areas, it seems to me too, where if we want to unlock the huge potential of green growth and new investment in green technology, where government has a role to play. And a couple of weeks ago, George Osborne announced plans for a green investment bank as a vehicle for encouraging investment in such technologies, green ISAs as a personal savings vehicle to provide funding for that. And he had already proposed and has successfully seen the launch of the world's first green trading market. George has talked about the importance of ensuring that the Treasury itself does not regard these issues as peripheral to the vital agenda of returning to the path of growth, but actually sees the importance of sustainable growth and marrying the green agenda to an agenda of economic renewal. And those are specific policy proposals that he set out to achieve that. Of course, an incredibly important thing that government must do is ensure that we have a macroeconomic framework that is stable and benign in terms of encouraging investment decisions. In the short term, that will mean taking the measures to ensure that lending by banks resumed and that we're able to grow again, and not losing sight of the fact that in order for growth to return, we actually need businesses to grow and invest and return to profit. What is this about in the medium to long term? This can't be, it seems to me, an agenda which is a negative one or a painful one or one which runs the risk of putting off whole swathes of public opinion. The minister was asked if he believed in prosperity without growth, the extraordinary title of a report by the Sustainable Development Commission. I wasn't sure what his answer was. Well, let me tell you what my answer is. There is no prosperity without growth. The challenge for us is to ensure that we secure growth which is sustainable. That is a clear answer. And indeed, in my view, growth, unless it is sustainable, unless you can sustain it in the long run, is no growth at all, as we have discovered. What we have to set out, it seems to me, is a vision of a good future for the people, a good future for business, not a future which is going to demand unreasonable sacrifice, not a future which is going to demand painful decisions which people will not take, not a future which is anti-business, but a future where actually we are living within our environmental means, where we have achieved our environmental security, and a future which actually offers tremendous opportunities, both for business in terms of the new technology and growth which we can realise. Opportunities which to some extent I believe Britain is losing at the moment by lagging behind in certain key areas. A very good example seems to me to be in relation to waste policy, where because we have been a laggard and have been willing simply to chuck our waste into holes in the ground, an extremely damaging form of disposal of waste, we have watched as other countries have driven forward with new technologies such as anaerobic digestion, interesting ways to generate energy from waste, new technologies for recycling, kinds of technologies I've seen for myself almost always with machinery that has been built, designed in our peer group countries. We are losing a manufacturing opportunity by being a laggard in this respect, and a technological opportunity. It is one that is not lost for us forever. We can certainly reclaim it. So let us take great care to portray the future as being a negative one. And above all, let us take care to ensure that we maintain what I believe is an immensely important consensus about the need for action in the areas that I've set out. There is a political consensus at the moment, and that consensus, I believe, will last. And the political voices which are challenging whether or not we should be taking effective action in relation to dangerous climate change are clearly in a very small minority in this country. It's not so, as we've seen in other countries. And as I said at the beginning, we have a public that is suspicious of this agenda. It is time, I believe, to be positively green, to set out an agenda of opportunity, of markets flourishing, of investment, of green growth, of hope, and a good future for people in this country. And if we do that, I believe we have a real chance, not just of taking the right decisions, but of implementing the decisions in the right way and making the fundamental changes that we need to in order to ensure our environmental security in the future.